The October Revolution was a pivotal moment that dramatically reshaped the course of Russian history. But how did an empire ruled by an autocratic Tsar collapse so suddenly? What fueled the uprising, and what came after? To understand the revolution of 1917, we need to rewind the clock back to the early 20th century. In 1905, Tsarist Russia lagged far behind Western Europe, especially in terms of economic development and industrialization. Workers toiled for long hours in hazardous conditions, earning meager wages. As frustration grew, strikes and protests erupted across the empire. On January 22, 1905, a peaceful march, led by an Orthodox priest named Georgy Gapon, gathered in front of the Winter Palace. Their demands were simple: better wages, shorter hours, and more humane treatment. But what followed became known as Bloody Sunday. Imperial troops opened fire on the unarmed crowd, killing hundreds. This massacre ignited nationwide outrage and marked the beginning of the revolution. In response, Tsar Nicholas II issued the October Manifesto, granting limited civil liberties and creating the Duma, a parliamentary body. While these concessions temporarily calmed the unrest, deeper issues remained unresolved. Then came World War I in 1914. The war placed enormous strain on Russia's fragile infrastructure. Food shortages, inflation, and battlefield defeats pushed the population toward desperation. On February 18, 1917, workers at the massive Putilov factory in Petrograd went on strike, demanding pay increases to match the soaring cost of living. Instead of addressing their grievances, factory owners fired thousands of workers. This only intensified the unrest. By February 23rd, which happened to be International Women's Day, women joined the protests, demanding equality and better living conditions. The demonstrations swelled in size and significance. Tsar Nicholas II ordered the army to suppress the uprising with force. But this time, something unprecedented happened. The soldiers refused to fire. Many even joined the protesters. With the military siding with the people, the protests evolved into a full-blown revolution. On March 15, 1917, Tsar Nicholas II was forced to abdicate the throne. His brother, Grand Duke Michael, declined the crown. With that, the centuries-old Romanov dynasty came to an end. A provisional government was established, led by former Duma members. However, the new leadership failed to meet the people's demands. Promises of land reform, labor rights, and peace were ignored. Worse yet, the government chose to continue fighting in World War I, hoping for a turnaround on the battlefield to regain public support. Meanwhile, Vladimir Lenin, exiled in Switzerland, saw his moment. With German assistance, he secretly returned to Russia, aiming to capitalize on the growing dissatisfaction. Lenin, leader of the radical Bolshevik faction of the Russian Social Democratic Labor Party, began rallying support. In July 1917, a failed uprising by soldiers and workers in Petrograd, supported by the Bolsheviks, was violently suppressed. Hundreds were killed. Lenin fled to Finland. Many of his comrades, including Leon Trotsky, were arrested, but the fire had not been extinguished. By October 1917, Lenin returned and pushed for an armed revolt. On the night of October 24th, according to the Julian calendar, November 6/7 by the Gregorian, the Bolsheviks launched their uprising. Government buildings, communication hubs, and transportation centers were swiftly taken with minimal resistance. Only the Winter Palace remained in the hands of the provisional government. Protected by around 1,500 troops, the palace was symbolically significant. On the night of October 25th, the cruiser Aurora fired a blank shot as a signal. Thousands of Red Guards stormed the palace. After 2 hours of combat, they seized it. By dawn, the Bolsheviks had seized power. Stalin's rise and the birth of a totalitarian regime. 1924 to 1936. The revolution had ended, but the struggle for power had just begun. After Lenin's death in January 1924, the Soviet Union entered a new era, one filled with uncertainty, ambition, and ruthless power plays. Two names stood at the forefront of this battle: Leon Trotsky, the brilliant revolutionary general, and Joseph Stalin, the patient, calculating bureaucrat who controlled the party machinery. Stalin had one major advantage: power over appointments. As General Secretary, he quietly placed loyalists in key positions while keeping Lenin's final testament, which strongly criticized him, hidden from most party members. With cunning precision, he built alliances, first with Kamenev and Zinoviev, to marginalize Trotsky, then turned on them when they outlived their usefulness. By 1927, Trotsky was expelled from the party. A year later, he was exiled to Kazakhstan. In 1929, he was deported from the USSR entirely. The man who had once commanded the Red Army would spend the rest of his life in exile, until Stalin's agent finally assassinated him in Mexico in 1940. With Trotsky out of the picture, Stalin was now the unchallenged leader of the Soviet Union. The first wave of terror, collectivization, and famine. But Stalin's rule would not be marked by peace. From 1928 onwards, he launched a radical transformation of Soviet society known as collectivization. Wealthy peasants, called kulaks, were branded as enemies of the state. Special detachments were sent to the countryside to confiscate their grain. Villages were forced to give up their land, livestock, and equipment to form kolkhozes, collective farms, or sovkhozes, state-owned farms. Any resistance was met with arrests, exile, or worse. By 1930, over 320,000 households had been affected by the campaign to liquidate the kulaks as a class. Entire families were sent to labor camps in Siberia. Many never returned. But collectivization didn't go as planned. Faced with the loss of their land, many peasants began slaughtering their animals and sabotaging crops. Food production plummeted. As millions of rural people fled to overcrowded cities, the Soviet Union's fragile food system began to collapse. Then came the famine of 1932 to 1933, one of the deadliest in human history. While poor weather played a part, it was Stalin's policies, forced grain requisition, brutal suppression of peasant resistance, and a refusal to provide aid that turned a crisis into a catastrophe. Nowhere was the suffering greater than in Ukraine, where millions starved. Historians continue to debate whether this famine, known as the Holodomor, was a deliberate act of genocide or a result of cruel indifference. What is certain is this: between 5 to 7 million people perished. Despite the horrific toll, Stalin refused to take responsibility. To him, the people had betrayed the state by hoarding grain and resisting collectivization. In the eyes of the regime, they were saboteurs, not victims. Industrial ambition and the Great Leap Forward. While the countryside starved, the Soviet leadership pushed forward with a bold agenda: rapid industrialization. The goal was to catch up with and eventually surpass the capitalist West. Stalin launched a series of 5-year plans, pouring resources into mining, steel production, transportation, and infrastructure. Projects like the Moscow Metro and the White Sea-Baltic Canal became symbols of Soviet ambition. But these grand achievements were built on the backs of millions of workers, many of them prisoners in the vast Gulag labor camp system. The shift from agrarian life to urban industrial labor transformed Soviet society. But it also brought with it massive challenges: overcrowded cities, housing shortages, and growing dissatisfaction among the workers. Stalin's solution? Tighten control even further. By the mid-1930s, nearly all state power was concentrated in Stalin's hands. But despite his dominance, he remained deeply paranoid. The slightest hint of opposition, the faintest whisper of betrayal, could not be tolerated. The Great Purge was coming. A second wave of terror was about to sweep across the USSR. And this time, no one, not even Stalin's closest allies, would be safe. Fall of Stalin and the collapse of the Soviet Empire, 1936 to 1991. From the height of totalitarian power to the quiet end of a superpower, the Great Purge and the Reign of Terror, 1936 to 1939. As Stalin consolidated his grip on the Soviet Union, his rule took an even darker turn. In 1934, the NKVD, the People's Commissariat for Internal Affairs, was formed, centralizing the Soviet security, intelligence, and internal policing into a single, all-powerful body. Under the leadership of Nikolai Yezhov, known as the Bloody Dwarf, for both his short stature and his unmatched brutality, Stalin unleashed one of the most terrifying campaigns in modern history, the Great Purge. Between 1936 and 1938, 3 major show trials shocked the world. Stalin's former comrades, Zinoviev, Kamenev, Bukharin, Rykov, were accused of treason, espionage, and sabotage. All were executed. But the bloodshed didn't end there. Thousands of military commanders, party officials, intellectuals, artists, and ordinary citizens were swept up in the purges. Entire ethnic groups, Poles, Germans, Greeks, Koreans, were exiled or executed during the national operations. By 1938, over 1.6 million people had been arrested. 700,000 were executed. The Soviet Union, once a beacon of revolutionary hope, had become a nation ruled by fear and silence. But Stalin needed someone to blame. Yezhov, once his loyal enforcer, was declared a traitor and executed in 1940. Stalin, as always, remained untouched. The Nazi-Soviet Pact and the Great Patriotic War, 1939 to 1945. In a shocking move, Stalin signed a non-aggression pact with Adolf Hitler on August 23, 1939. This Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact divided Eastern Europe into spheres of influence, allowing both powers to expand. But peace would not last. On June 22, 1941, Hitler betrayed Stalin and launched Operation Barbarossa, the largest military invasion in history. Stalin, caught completely off guard, vanished from public view for days. His purges had gutted the Red Army, leaving it vulnerable in the face of the Wehrmacht's blitzkrieg. Yet Stalin rebounded. He rallied the people with fierce propaganda, describing the war as a patriotic war. He ordered a scorched earth policy and brutal discipline. Retreat. Stalin's final years, and the Cold War begins, 1945 to 1953. Post-war, Stalin emerged more powerful than ever. He assumed the title of Generalissimo and launched a full-scale cult of personality. His face adorned every wall. His words were printed in every paper. His rule became unquestionable. Domestically, vast infrastructure projects began, but shortages and famine returned. Millions remained in gulags. Internationally, Stalin's focus shifted to countering American influence, especially after the U.S. unveiled its atomic bomb. By 1949, the Soviets had successfully tested their own nuclear weapon. The Cold War was now official. Stalin's final years were marked by paranoia. He purged doctors, suspected Zionists, and even those closest to him. He trusted no one. On March 5, 1953, Stalin died of a cerebral hemorrhage. He left no clear successor, only a nation exhausted by decades of fear and war. De-Stalinization and Khrushchev's reforms, 1953 to 1964. After Stalin's death, a brief collective leadership was formed, but it was Nikita Khrushchev who rose to power by 1955. In 1956, he shocked the world with his secret speech, denouncing Stalin's crimes and the cult of personality. This marked the start of de-Stalinization. Labor camps were emptied, censorship was relaxed. A cautious thaw began across the USSR. But Khrushchev's rule wasn't without crisis. The construction of the Berlin Wall in 1961 and the near-apocalyptic Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962 damaged his credibility. By 1964, he was forced into retirement. The era of Brezhnev, stagnation behind the Iron Curtain, 1964 to 1982. Leonid Brezhnev succeeded Khrushchev, bringing stability and stagnation. The Soviet Union remained a superpower, but internal decay was setting in. Though the USSR expanded its influence across the globe from Africa to Southeast Asia, its economy faltered, weighed down by inefficiency and massive military spending. In 1968, Brezhnev sent tanks into Czechoslovakia to crush the Prague Spring, enforcing the so-called Brezhnev Doctrine. Socialism could not be reversed. Rebellion would not be tolerated. The Afghan quagmire and Gorbachev's rise, 1979 to 1985. In 1979, the Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan to support a communist regime, but the war dragged on, draining resources and morale. The Red Army found itself in a bloody guerrilla conflict, the Soviet Vietnam. By 1985, the USSR needed change. Enter Mikhail Gorbachev. Perestroika, Glasnost, and the collapse, 1985 to 1991. Gorbachev introduced two major reforms. Perestroika, economic restructuring, allowing limited market activity. Glasnost, political openness, relaxing censorship and encouraging criticism. But these reforms unleashed forces no one could control. Ethnic tensions erupted. Nationalist movements grew. The Chernobyl disaster in 1986 shattered public trust. In 1990 to 1991, republics across the USSR, from the Baltics to Georgia, Ukraine, and Armenia, began declaring independence. In August 1991, hardliners attempted a coup. Tanks rolled into Moscow, but the people, led by Boris Yeltsin, resisted. The coup collapsed within days. On December 25, 1991, Mikhail Gorbachev resigned. The red flag was lowered over the Kremlin. the Soviet Union had ceased to exist. Conclusion: the rise and fall of a superpower. From the revolution of 1917 to the quiet end in 1991, the Soviet Union's journey was one of immense ambition, brutal repression, groundbreaking achievements, and devastating failures. It launched the first satellite and the first man into space. It defeated Nazism. It built a vast empire and watched it crumble under its own weight. Was it an experiment in equality gone wrong, or a dictatorship cloaked in ideology? That answer lies with you, the viewer. Thank you for watching. Don't forget to subscribe to History Spectrum for more deep dives into the turning points of world history.